Sorry, folks. Okay. So you'll probably see a little box that says this is being recorded, and you'll need to click on that so that you can remain in the meeting. Okay, and now Carl, if you'll remove me as a spotlight, I don't know if I can remove myself.
I am doing that.
Okay, good. Okay, go take it away, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, or I guess good afternoon, just barely. Thank you for having me in the 21st century public square of Zoom. I appreciate the invite. Loretta and I got to know each other when she was a very active member of our County Democratic Central Committee, a post I held before I was in the legislature as well. So appreciate all her contributions to the community. I'm just going to chat for a few minutes, and then hopefully we can open up for questions, because I'd rather talk about what you all want to talk about than what I want to talk about. So I'm not a U.S. senator, so I'll actually have a nice back and forth with you instead of just filibuster the whole hour here. But I represent District 16 in the Maryland House of Delegates. District 16 is largely Bethesda, part of Potomac. It includes Friendship Heights, Glen Echo, Cabin John, what we used to call White Flint when I was a kid, but is now either North Bethesda or the Pike District, or whatever we're calling it these days, up by the old mall there. And a few other communities in between. I like to orient people in when talking about my work in the legislature, because we are a company town, and that company is the federal government. When I go door to door in District 16, I'm far more likely to talk about a U.S. House race in Montana than I am a House of Delegates race in Maryland. So I just like to do a little bit of compare and contrast with how the Maryland legislature operates versus the federal legislature, which we're obviously much more familiar with, the U.S. House and the Senate. So, one big difference is that we have multi-member districts. So I serve in the House of Delegates alongside Delegate Sarah Love and Delegate Ariana Kelly. We represent the exact same geographic area, District 16 in the House. We also have a state senator who represents the exact same geographic area, Susan Lee. We're one of about 10 states with multi-member districts like that, but we're the only state where the House districts and the Senate districts are also identical. So you actually have 4 state representatives representing you in the legislature, 3 in the House and 1 in the Senate. We're also part-time, unlike the federal government. Actually, unlike our county government, our county council members are also full-time now. We are a part-time legislature. We call it a citizen legislature. Only about 5 to 10 states have full-time state legislatures. So we're in the vast majority of having a part-time system. What that means is we meet in Annapolis for our sort of annual legislative session for 90 days between mid-January and mid-April every year. Obviously, we do a lot of activities outside of the legislative session. We still have committee hearings and obviously constituent service and preparing legislation for the next hearing, for the next session. But the bulk of our sort of legislative work is during that 90-day legislative session. So again, very different than Capitol Hill. We're also staffed very differently. A U.S. House member might have 30 staffers. A senator probably has 60 to 80. Even our county council members have 5 or 6 staffers each. In the House of Delegates, we each have 1 staffer year-round, and then usually an additional shared staffer during the legislative session, because we have so many more appointments and things during that time. So we're a much lighter operation. A lot of our staffing is centralized. We have something called the Department of Legislative Services in Annapolis. It sort of fulfills the role, if you think about the federal system, that the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office, and the committee staff all fill in the federal system. For us, that's all the Department of Legislative Services. So a lot of our staffing is more centralized than in the federal system. We also have different rules regarding fundraising. Even our most diligent members of Congress and the Senate spend part of almost every day raising money. That's a function of their jobs. During our legislative session, fundraising is banned. We are not allowed to solicit, raise, ask for, accept, or deposit campaign contributions during our 90-day legislative session. I think that was put in place because of concerns about corruption, but I think the real benefit of it is it ensures that we're focusing on what we're supposed to be doing, which is working on legislation and working with on behalf of our constituents during that 90-day legislative session. Another big difference is that we each only serve on 1 committee. So Jamie Raskin, our terrific member of Congress, he serves on, I think, 3 different committees in the U.S. House of Representatives, and often they are meeting at the same time. They might be meeting while the floor session's going on. A lot of things are happening all at once. In Annapolis, the House of Delegates only has 5 committees. The State Senate has, or the House of Delegates has 6 committees. The State Senate has 5 committees. Each member only serves on 1 committee. So I serve on the Appropriations Committee, where I chair the subcommittee on transportation and the environment. And so the budgets of any agency that works on transportation or environmental issues goes through my subcommittee. The budget is submitted by the governor every year. We sort of work on it and perform quite a bit of oversight during our legislative session, and then usually pass it on time before we adjourn for the year, and then it takes effect later in the summer. The Appropriations Committee is a great perch because everything costs money, so it gives you the ability to sort of stick your nose into any issue or any concern that folks have. Now, because I chair a subcommittee on transportation and the environment, I think that's what I sort of said my topic would be today. So I'll just talk, briefly about that. And again, I want to get to your questions. I see one has already shown up in the chat, and of course, happy to take them there or hear them orally, however folks want to do it. Oftentimes, I am at events with people who are very concerned, rightfully so, about climate change, and it's a sensible concern. I mean, it used to be a little bit more of an esoteric issue, but when you have flash floods in parts of Montgomery County where we've never seen them before, or you have 100-year storms twice a year, it becomes a little bit more of an urgent challenge and an urgent issue. And one of the things I often hear from people is Maryland's not doing anything about climate change. And I'm here to report that, we are doing some things about climate change. It's not enough. Frankly, nothing Maryland can do will ever be enough, because Maryland is just one state in a country and the United States is just one country on earth. But we can do our part. We can sort of, we can labor our portion of the oar. And we can also set a standard for others to follow. Oftentimes, in this country, we look to California as the sort of model of environmental policy, and they're doing some great things, but there's some great things Maryland's involved with as well that can hopefully be a model for the country. So we have some really ambitious goals in Maryland. I do think we need to do more to sort of achieve those goals in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, renewable energy generation, conservation, things of that nature. If you look at our greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland, only about 30% now is from our electricity consumption. And the reason that number has declined is 2 reasons. One, we have something called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. It's our sort of goal of getting more of our electricity from renewable sources. We have a goal in Maryland of 50% by 2030. We're at pretty close to 30% now. 7.5% of that is from solar. Quite a bit's from wind, and a few other smaller sources. We import quite a bit of that, though. It's not all generated in Maryland. We're part of a regional grid, and so a lot of our renewable electricity, just like our non-renewable electricity, frankly, comes from other states. So it's not all, that 7.5% solar is not all being generated in the state of Maryland, although we do have an in-state goal within that 7.5%. If a utility is not able to meet the renewable goal, they pay an alternative compliance payment. They basically make a payment into a fund that we can then use for other clean energy programs. So for example, for a while, some alternative compliance payments being made by some of our utilities was being used to fund our electric vehicle tax credit to encourage broader adoption of electric vehicles. So 30% is of our greenhouse gas emissions is from electricity consumption. As I said, that's been going down, both because of the Renewable Portfolio Standard and then something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. This is a cap and trade program that Maryland participates in with a number of other northeastern states, and now Virginia has just joined, and Pennsylvania may be joining soon, but it's largely sort of New England and the New York area. And this is a cap and trade program for our power plants, for our energy, for our electricity sort of generating function. And so that's been a very successful program in bringing down the level of carbon we're emitting. But because it's sort of a market-based system, we are able to invest some funds as well. So RGGI has been very useful both for clean energy funds, but also helping folks with low income cover their energy bills. So that's been a very successful program. Like I said, there's still a lot to do. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we should rest on our laurels, but there are some success stories that Maryland has been a part of. We need to keep lowering that cap that we have for our cap and trade program for energy emissions. We probably need to expand it to other sectors. I'll talk about one in a moment. And of course, our renewable goal needs to keep increasing. And we also need to make sure we're actually meeting the goal. It's not enough to just have a goal. We obviously have to meet it. And there's a lot more we can do on that front. I've personally been very involved in issues around energy storage, which is basically usually batteries, but there are other systems as well that allow you to store electricity for later use. That's important because renewables are intermittent, right? The sun isn't always shining, the wind's not always blowing. And when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing is not always equal to the amount of energy needed at that time. Energy storage allows you to basically bank that electricity for a later time when the demand is up. So for example, the wind tends to blow more at night. So people aren't using as much electricity at night once they're in bed and they're sort of done with the dishwasher and the washing machine, the TV, and they're just sleeping with all the lights off. So that's a great time for us to store electricity. In Maryland, we've basically started doing some pilot projects around energy storage. Every utility, thanks to a law that I passed along with State Senator Brian Feldman, is required to do some pilot projects, but other states have gone further. Other states have a requirement that every utility have a certain percentage of capacity available for energy storage. And of course, we need to sort of keep moving in that direction. For those of you who follow our work in Annapolis, you might have heard this past year, there was something called the Climate Solutions Act that did not pass, although a number of elements of it did pass, but the broad bill did not pass. One of the things in that broad bill was increasing our building standards, because an incredible amount of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from just normal construction and buildings for various reasons, often because of energy inefficiency reasons. Buildings are not built as efficiently as they could be because it's expensive. And that leads to basically a lot of energy leakage that is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. We did pass one element of that legislation that I was heavily involved with, which is to transition our 800 Maryland bus fleet. In the state of Maryland, our Maryland Transit Administration runs the local bus service in Baltimore, as well as some commuter buses. They have about 800 buses. We passed a standalone bill to transition that fleet to entirely zero emissions. After this next year, the state will no longer be able to buy non-zero emission buses. Now, of course, they don't buy 800 buses a year, so it'll be sort of a slow transition and phasing out of our traditional sort of fossil fuel buses to a zero emission model going forward. So that's a great transition over to transportation. And transportation is actually the largest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, 40% of Maryland's greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. I mentioned RGGI, our cap and trade program for power plant emissions that were part of sort of a regional partnership. Maryland is also at the table for a regional partnership related to emissions from the transportation sector called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI. This is many years behind RGGI. RGGI began in the mid-aughts, around 2004, 2005. Maryland joined in, I think, 2007. TCI is new. And Maryland has been at the negotiating table, but has not yet formally signed on. So far, I think Connecticut, Massachusetts, and maybe DC are the only participants in TCI, but it's a similar type program to RGGI. We would basically cap the amount of emissions that you can emit from the transportation sector, and that cap would be lowered over time, and it basically causes an incentive to transition the fleet to more efficient models. So for example, a battery powered vehicle does not emit directly greenhouse gases, right? Now it might do it indirectly depending on how it's charged, but it doesn't directly emit greenhouse gases. And even the indirect emissions, if it's generating from traditional fossil fuels, are actually still less harmful because there are higher efficiency standards and cleaning standards for our power plants than there are for our tailpipes. So a battery powered vehicle is better than a greenhouse gas emitting vehicle, even if you're charging from a dirty source. But obviously over time, the goal is for our electricity consumption to be more and more green, so that you'd be charging from a clean source. So TCI is sort of currently in progress. It's as I said, Maryland is at the negotiating table, but it's pretty important. It would be great to see both of these regional programs continue and expand. So for example, RGGI the next likely potential candidate there is North Carolina to sort of spread further south and getting them involved. As I said, Pennsylvania is in the process of joining. So really important program. I'll just talk a little bit more about transportation, and then I'll turn it over to you all. I'll focus on transit. Obviously, there's a lot we can talk about in transportation. I'm happy to sort of answer questions in afterwards about roads or bridges or airports. Transit is another area where I think we've made a lot of great progress in Maryland, but there's still a lot more to do. Governor Hogan, traditionally, I would say, has not been inclined towards mass transit. It hasn't been sort of his passion. When he was elected, he canceled the Red Line, which was a light rail line that was proposed for Baltimore City that was sort of in the same level of progress as the Purple Line was at that time. He canceled that. He put the Purple Line on a little bit of turnaround, although now that project is moving along. It's moving along very slowly. If people have questions about that, I'm happy to sort of talk about the contract difficulties there. But eventually, the Purple Line will open. The governor was not particularly excited about dedicated funding for WMATA, for our regional metro system, but eventually he did come to the table with our partners in Virginia and DC. Actually, was a bill that I sponsored again with Senator Feldman to make Maryland's contribution to dedicated funding for Metro. Dedicated funding for Metro is really important because traditionally Metro is sort of funded on a year-to-year basis, which meant when they were issuing bonds to borrow money to invest in their capital, they did not get a very favorable rate of interest on those bonds. So the money wasn't going as far as it could because they didn't have that sort of dedicated funding source to back it. Now that they have the dedicated funding source, they're able to borrow more money more cheaply and have been investing it back into their capital. That's been successful. They've had fewer safety issues, fewer track fires, things like that as a result of their capital reinvestment. It can also be frustrating if you're a regular rider. You know that oftentimes when construction is being done, it requires station closures or single lining or other disruptions on the system. Unfortunately, oftentimes those disruptions are a sign of progress. It certainly doesn't feel that way when you're sitting on a train that's delayed. I certainly appreciate that as a regular rider myself, at least in non-COVID times. But there is some progress being made there. But there's a lot more to do on the transit front. This past legislative session, the governor vetoed a bill that would have basically provided a similar capital investment into our state transit system. As I said, in Maryland, the Maryland Transit Administration runs the local transit service in the city of Baltimore. Their light rail system, they have a one-line subway, and their bus system, they have a huge capital backlog that we were trying to get funded this year. The governor vetoed that bill, although we will likely override that veto when the legislature next convenes. And then there's sort of future projects. I mean, this is the first time in anybody's recollection of 50 or 60 years that Maryland doesn't have sort of a major transit project in the planning stage. There's a lot of sort of ideas out there, but there's no active planning going on projects like the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit Line, or the idea of extending the Marc Rail system to Hagerstown. The Marc Rail is our commuter rail system that currently runs to Frederick and then also goes west towards West Virginia. So a lot to do on the transit front. So again, I'd rather hear from you all and answer your questions than keep talking. I'll just note, I'm sure we won't get to everything today. I'm pretty easy to find if you Google me, if you ever have any questions or concerns, but markkorman.com is my website, Mark with a C, Korman with a K, or mark@markkorman.com is the best way to email me. You can find me on Twitter or Facebook and so on. But really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to exchange some thoughts with you all. And I guess I'm not sure if Carl or Loretta or who's emceeing here or how we want to handle questions, but happy to hear from folks.
Okay, this is Carl. I'm going to handle this part regarding the questions from our group. For you people that had late joined in, the format that we're following now is for the people that submitted questions in chat. We will take those first and I can read them out. They are different ones, so I'll read them out individually for you, Mark. And then afterwards, we are going to have the time today to take them one-on-one. And the format that we're going to need to use is by doing the electronic raising of the hand. And so for people on your screen, certainly on the computer screen, I don't know about a smartphone, but down in the lower panel under reactions, you're going to see various icons there and click on raise hand. So then I will then do that myself, and then we will follow those in sequence. And then for one other aspect to become a little more familiar, like we have been in our fireside room, I'm going to take Mark off of the spotlight, and we're going to put everybody into gallery view. So you can do that yourselves, folks, in your upper right-hand corner under view to go into gallery. If you can go from on-click speaker into gallery, and then we're all here now. And I might ask for those, if you are going to ask a question and yours come up, to try and activate your video so we can get to see you speaking. So right now, we had a couple chat questions, and the first one was from Tricia Tice. I would like to ask a question about heat pumps replacing gas furnaces and water heaters.
I'm not sure. I think she wants to ask the question. I'm not sure that is the question. So Tricia, do you want to?
Yeah,
Expound a
Tricia,
little
go
further.
ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question. She's also a raised hand.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will.
Tricia, you're muted.
You have to unmute.
There you go.
Thank you. Where do I start? Methane is second only to carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And natural gas is basically pure methane. Berkeley, California has already banned the installation of natural gas furnaces to any new construction and or upgrades to existing buildings. I had personally tried to figure out how to install a heat pump to replace the aging furnace in my house. And I know they're going by different names, but basically they're modified air source heat pumps that are called cold climate heat pumps. I gave up and I ended up putting a high efficiency gas furnace back in my house because none of the installers of HVAC systems have any idea about heat pumps in general.
Tricia,
And
can we get your question, please?
the question is, can the state get involved in education about these cold climate heat pumps so that the professionals in that area know what to install to replace natural gas? Because other people have asked me, because they want to get out in front, they need to replace it and,
Yep.
and find anybody to install them.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. I think certainly at least providing education, is different than sort of mandating that we don't have natural gas hookups anymore, which I know is what some places have been starting to do or talked about doing. And I have a colleague, Delegate Sharkudian, who's sort of pushed some things like that. We could talk a little bit more about some natural gas and some things we've been working on that front. But I'm going to actually take your idea to the Occupational Licensing Board for our HVAC techs to see if there's something we can put in place. It's a great idea. So I just wrote that down. And I put my email in the chat if you want to follow up with me on it, but I'll try to email them later today to see what they think. So thank you for the—
Delegate Gorman, could you clarify for the rest of us in your audience, you hold the position of chair of transportation and environment. Now, are those two distinct generally categories, the nuts and bolts and logistic of transportation in all of the environment, or is it environment term to be part of the aspect of the nuts and bolts transportation?
Yeah, so our appropriations committee deals with all aspects of the budget. And so we're sort of organized by category. So obviously we don't have, there's something like 40 or 50 state agencies. We don't have a subcommittee for each one of them. So transportation and the environment was grouped together a long time ago, long before I got there. Actually, Comptroller Francho was the chair of this subcommittee before he became comptroller. So it's been around a while, as is he. And so it's all the different agencies that work on transportation and environmental issues. It's just the pairing they made that seemed to make sense. I mean, we have an education and economic development subcommittee as well that deals with both all the different educational agencies as well as economic development agencies. We just had to sort of need an organizing principle. Now, I do think they go very well together because I think there's quite a bit of overlap between the two, but I'm not sure it was sort of planned that way from the start. I think it just was sort of an easy way to organize things.
Okay, our next chat question is from Catherine Gogorovich, and it's incineration needs to be removed from the renewable portfolio standard. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so the renewable portfolio standard overall is a very positive thing, as I tried to explain in my comments, but it's not perfect. And it definitely has some sources in it that we, if you're sort of thinking about renewables, are not what you think about, right? It's not all wind and solar. Until very recently, there was something called black liquor included, which was a byproduct from our paper mills. That's actually been removed now, but that was not a very clean energy source. But incineration, specifically domestic incineration, what I mean by that is Maryland-based incineration, is still included. So incineration is not a resource that we can import the way we can import solar or wind. That doesn't get credit under the renewable portfolio standard. But domestic incineration does, incineration in the state of Maryland. And there have been many efforts to remove incineration. I think those efforts will continue because I agree it does not belong in there. But it's an ongoing effort to get that cleaned up. And frankly, it's one of these areas, and there are quite a few of them in the environmental realm, where some of our friends in the labor community don't entirely see eye to eye with some of our friends in the environmental community. Oftentimes they're allied on major issues, but around incineration, another example is natural gas that we were just talking about, is an area where there's been quite a bit of disagreement. I found myself in the odd position as a somewhat progressive Democrat from Montgomery County, being on the other side of the labor movements on something called the Natural Gas Expansion Fund, which I've worked to shift from expanding natural gas usage to being used instead to improve efficiency, to fix pipelines rather than build new ones to avoid leaks and things like that. But the labor community was very committed to expansion of natural gas, and again, very committed to maintaining incineration in the RPS. So that is an ongoing struggle, Catherine.
And we have a second question by Catherine. Is Hogan's P3 boondoggle for 270 in the American Legion Bridge a done deal?
Yeah. So first of all, Catherine, I know you're a frequent correspondent of mine, so it's nice to see your face that goes with the email address. Yeah, I mean, let me just take a step back and talk about the public-private partnership the governor's proposed for I-270 and I-495. I literally give like 2-hour talks on this topic, so I'm going to try to make this relatively brief. But about 3 or 4 years ago, the governor announced a plan to add 2 new lanes in each direction along the entirety of the Maryland portion of the Capitol Beltway, and 270 all the way from the Beltway to Frederick, where it dead ends into I-70. He said this was all going to be done with private dollars. There would be a private partner that would pay for everything, including rebuilding the existing roads. I think a lot of people have skepticism about the approach. I think that skepticism exists on a number of grounds. I don't think the skepticism is that we like traffic, right? I don't think people are saying they're happy to sit in traffic and don't want to see improvements to traffic on the Beltway and 270. I mean, I think anybody who's spent any time trying to commute somewhere or get somewhere when they'd rather be home with their family or already at their job billing hours or whatever it is, doesn't want to see traffic increase and would like to see it improve. But that doesn't mean adding multiple lanes, toll lanes in each direction is going to actually solve the problem you're trying to solve and won't have environmental consequences. And potentially, because of the nature of these public-private partnerships, could be a real sort of money loser for the state. If you look at the Purple Line, which is the other major public-private partnership, I would say that's not going well. And we could talk about that, but that is a project that is now years behind schedule, and they're in the process of finding a new construction partner after the previous construction partner walked away about 40% of the way through the project. So instead of a functioning transit line between Montgomery and Prince George's County that I would love to ride someday, we basically have a jagged scar. I don't want to see that repeat on the Beltway in 270, but the governor is very committed to this public-private partnership. He views it as sort of a legacy item. And the structure of the public-private partnership law we have in Maryland gives him quite a bit of latitude here. That's a law the legislature passed in 2013 before I was elected, but it creates a very executive-driven process for the public-private partnership to go forward. So the legislature can stop the project if it so chooses, and we can talk more about that, but the legislature is not required to approve the project, right? So we can step in and push back against it, but he doesn't need to come to the legislature for sort of approval of the project. The only body he needs to go to is called the Board of Public Works, which is made up of the governor, the comptroller, and the state treasurer. He's been there with this project a number of times, including back in July for a major approval, where the treasurer, who's elected by the legislature, voted against the project, but the comptroller and the governor voted to continue the project. The House of Delegates has passed a number of pieces of legislation over 3 years now to put guardrails around this project. None would sort of just kill the project and say, no, you can't go forward, but they would have added various guardrails, including some changes to the overall P3 process going forward, because we're going to have more of these in the future. And I don't think we want to be in this position where, frankly, 2 people on the Board of Public Works can commit the state of Maryland to a 50-year contract worth tens of billions of dollars. That's not necessarily how a representative democracy is supposed to function. Unfortunately, our friends in the state Senate have not seen fit to pass any of that legislation. Senator Susan Lee, our state senator, has been a stalwart on this issue and has worked very hard to try to pass legislation, but unfortunately, she has not been able to convince a majority of her colleagues yet to join us. So I don't know that it's a done deed or a done deal. There's a number of sort of procedural hurdles that they have to get done. And depending on who's elected governor after Governor Hogan's term ends, which it ends next year, that could also put a big crimp in the project. Just briefly, where things are now, there's sort of 2 things happening simultaneously. There's an environmental review and there's the P3 contract. The environmental review, the next step is any day now, they will be issuing a supplemental environmental impact statement for the current iteration of the project that will be open to public comment. And then they hope sometime next year that they will be able to issue their final environmental impact statement and obtain what's called a record of decision from the Federal Highway Administration. That is a prerequisite to construction. They cannot break ground without those sort of environmental approvals. So they're hoping for that to happen. I know they're aiming for summer of next year. You know, things keep slipping with this project, so that could slip, but obviously they're under a lot of pressure to have that before Governor Hogan leaves office in January of 2023. The other sort of simultaneous action is the contracting phase. They just awarded last month, or in August, as I said, what's called a project development agreement to a consortium of companies, but they're led by a large Australian company called Transurban. That is makes a specialty of these public-private partnership road projects, including some of the ones in Virginia. And so that contract has been awarded. So now that project development agreement allows Transurban to begin sort of looking at the specific sections for construction. And so sometime next year as well, they will come forward with their first what's called section agreement, which says, okay, this is what we want to do to build the first phase of the project, and they'll go to the Board of Public Works for approval of that first section of construction. So that is, as briefly as I could, a summary of sort of where things are and the procedural hurdles that still remain. You know, obviously, I hold out hope for our friends in the state Senate, but I also think a change in the gubernatorial administration is sort of the biggest factor over what happens with this project.
All right, thank you. Now we have 2 raised hands, and I invite anyone else to click on that if they have questions. So first in line is Bruce Davis. Go and unmute, Bruce, and you're next.
You're still on mute. There you
Okay. The question is actually from me, Evelyn Jacob. Thank you for all you've done related to climate change. Can you give us a summary of what you think are the most important climate change legislative items coming up in the 2022 session?
Yeah. So it's a little early to say exactly for sure, because even the pre-filed bills are not in yet. So you can introduce legislation in advance. That usually comes in December. And then for the first sort of half of our legislative session, bills can be introduced. So it's a little hard to say comprehensively, but let me talk about sort of a few of the large pending issues that may not be in 2022, but will be in the next year or two that I think are going to be before the legislature, or at least before the state government. They might not all actually be legislative items. I mean, number one, and again, the goals are easy to talk about, but I'm not necessarily a huge fan of them, because I think what's really important is the policies in place to reach the goals. But I do think you're going to see that continued push to increase our renewable portfolio standard, our share of electricity consumption from renewable sources, to rise to 100%. I think that's an ongoing effort. When we did a couple of years ago the increase to 50% by 2030, we required sort of a plan to get to 100%. I think you'll see, shifting that plan into more of a legislative action item in the next year or two. So I think that's going to be a big one. I mentioned that the Climate Solutions Act didn't pass in the last legislative session, although a number of elements of it did, thankfully. I think that legislation in some form or another will be back. Now, I'm not sure it's going to be the giant comprehensive bill again. It might be smaller bills. I'll just be honest with you. Annapolis does better with smaller bills. We are not a state legislature that takes a 1,000-page bill and does a good job with it. We're a state legislature that takes a 10-page bill and does a great job with it. Now, obviously, page numbers don't necessarily tell you how important something is or how impactful something is, so I don't want to dwell on that for too long, but more of the policies in the Climate Solutions Act could have passed if more of them had been introduced as standalone bills. So I think, for example, on the building standards, you might see that as a standalone piece of legislation. But there are other elements of that bill that will probably be back, including transitioning our government fleet to all renewables. That's something we did for 1 year, and we've been doing it year to year in the budget, but I think you'll see more of a comprehensive change. And when I say our government fleet, I don't mean the buses that I talked about before. That's already transitioning, that law passed. But this is sort of like if the director, I'll give a local example. Attorney General Frosch has a state trooper who drives him places for safety and security. That vehicle, Brian actually already has a hybrid because he's Brian Frosch, but in the future, vehicles like that would all have to be clean emission vehicles, zero emission vehicles, if we pass sort of that standalone piece. So there's other things like that, other elements of the Climate Solutions Act that I think will be back. Another issue that I think is going to be a big one in our state comptroller's race, Comptroller Francho, who's been our comptroller since 2007, is running for governor. So there's an open seat there. One of the candidates running for comptroller, my colleague Brooke Learman, who actually grew up in Bethesda but now represents the city of Baltimore, is talking a lot about this, which is how our pension fund as a state invests in basically the fossil fuel industry, but also other contributors to climate change.
Right.
I think it's difficult as a legislature, frankly, for us to just pass a law saying stop investing in certain things. There's a real challenge there, which we can talk more about, fiduciary duty and so on and so forth. But there are other places where the trustees of pensions have found that it makes more economic sense to stop investing in these things for two reasons. One is there's physical risk to certain types of investments related to climate change. I would just say if you're making a 50-year investment, beachfront property is probably not the best idea. It makes a lovely vacation home, not necessarily a great long-term investment right now. And the other is the regulatory risk. I mean, if you believe that someday, somehow, Congress will act and start to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in a serious way, obviously that's going to have an effect on the leading industries that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, if you're thinking about 50 to 100-year investments, which is how our pension fund is supposed to operate, it's not a short-term investor. It can make more sense to not invest in these things. We passed a bill in 2018 that I authored that requires the pension fund to report every year on risks to the pension, including the risks from climate change. And so we now have some of the numbers to back what I was just saying. I just sort of gave you the qualitative. There's actually some quantitative analysis that backs that up as well. Again, I'm not sure that's going to be a bill, but that will be an issue in state government, I think, over the next year or two about how that pension fund invest. The great thing is there's policy entrepreneurship around this topic every year. More and more people are focusing on it in the state legislature. I'll just give you one brief success story. Over the last interim, so in the winter of 2020, I read a book about state electric policy around public service commissions or public utilities commissions, which are our state regulators of utilities. And it talked about how our People's Council, which is the sort of people's voice before the Public Service Commission, not necessarily in Maryland specifically, but broadly the way they're structured, is very focused on short-term rates, right? The rates people pay for electricity. And that's important. No one wants to pay more for electricity, right? People want to be able to live in their homes and go about their lives. However, our Office of People's Council probably also needs to think a little bit more long-term than are your rates going to go up for a couple of months and then sort of go back down as people adapt to changes, and think about things like the environment a little bit more. So we actually passed a reform bill this year to reform our Office of People's Council to give it an environmental mandate in addition to its residential ratepayer mandate. it was not a big fight. It did not take years and years of introducing that bill again and again. I had that idea last winter. We wrote the bill. We actually made some changes to it as a compromise that I won't bore you with, although if you're interested, Evelyn, send me an email. I would love to tell the story. And it passed, and now it's law. And the Office of People's Counsel is hiring a new associate general counsel to assist on environmental issues. You see in their filings before the Public Service Commission, before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and before the courts, much more discussion of the environment because it's now part of their mission, as well as sort of protecting residential ratepayers.
All right, I'm next in line with a question, then we have another chat. Mark, we all that live in the DC can at least appreciate the incredible complexity between state and regional governments, of course, in Maryland and in Virginia, and then we have DC, then we have regional associations like we have with the Metro. But now with President Biden's administration with the infrastructure bill, maybe you could kind of highlight the new dynamics of that. For instance, if Amtrak that goes up through Maryland, are your folks then strategizing how to best get the money out of that maybe tie in with Mark? Then we have, of course, Maryland and the 270 American Legion Bridge and the politics that's based down in Richmond. Just any random insights just so that we can see how difficult it is or the forces behind it, and are lobbyists ever involved?
Sure. Lobbyists are always involved. That First Amendment guarantees that their ability to be involved. Yeah, so I mean, first of all, just stepping back a little bit, when COVID first hit, and it's kind of amazing how I've gone this long without even mentioning COVID. It really shows you how numb we all are, frankly, to COVID. But I'll just say when COVID first hit, we were expecting, a really catastrophic economic impact. And while many people have had significant economic troubles on their own, in the aggregate, people have done okay. The economy held up better than most people expected for two reasons. One, especially important in our area where we have a lot of white collar workers, white collar work was able to shift to this environment we're in right now pretty easily. It didn't lead to sort of the mass layoffs in that sector that frankly you saw during the Great Recession. But the other one is the federal government stepped up with huge investments, huge amounts of money coming out of the federal government that basically filled all sorts of gaps, right? It was for individuals with higher unemployment. There were tax credits. People were able to get more access to healthcare, to childcare. And frankly, it filled state government and local government coffers in a way that meant they didn't have to do massive cuts, which is what was required in the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, Maryland had to actually cut funding to education, right? Which is unusual for Maryland. We didn't have to do that, at least not so far with COVID, because of the way the federal government stepped up, including on transportation. There's been quite a bit of money for transportation. That was really important last year because a lot of our traditional revenue sources for transportation fell through the floor, right? About 25% of our total transportation budget comes from motor fuel taxes. I think people think it's more than that. It's actually about 25%. A lot of it also comes from the federal government. So obviously they get some of it from motor taxes too, but it's state motor taxes. That revenue, dropped by like 90% when COVID began. So the government was able to step in and really fill those coffers, which allowed us to sort of maintain and in some cases increase our investments. Now we are certainly hoping to see it happen again with a massive infrastructure bill, as well as the sort of reconciliation bill that's being talked about. And there's a lot of ideas for how to use that money. They're not necessarily new projects. They're things that have sort of been on the books for a long time that we've known we have need for. So you mentioned Amtrak. This is a great example. There's a tunnel in Baltimore called the Bnp Tunnel that is from just after the Civil War. And the entire Northeast corridor for Amtrak, their sort of signature line, has to go through this small tunnel in Baltimore, as does the MARC trains. It needs to be replaced to have more capacity so we can run more trains through it, and also for safety reasons. It's 160 years old. It's just nothing lasts forever. So there is a plan in place to do that now, and it is expected that one of the major uses of the infrastructure money would be to replace the Bnp Tunnel. They're actually also changing the name. It's going to be called the Frederick Douglass Tunnel going forward. So they have the location, they have the plans. We just need the cash. So that's an expected major use of the infrastructure money. There's a bridge called Long Bridge between DC and Virginia that needs to be replaced if we're going to have run-through commuter rail service. Those would be MARC trains that run directly through Virginia without having to change trains, and VRE trains, the MARC equivalent of Virginia, that would run straight through into Maryland. The Long Bridge needs to be replaced for that. That's something that's been on the books for a long time, been talked about for a long time. The infrastructure bill is expected to sort of open up the opportunity to actually fund that. There's a lot of projects like that. I picked two rail ones because I like that stuff, but there's some road projects in that camp as well. I don't think it's people just sitting around sort of dreaming up entirely new projects. It's things that we've sort of long had a need for, that we know about, that this infrastructure bill is going to allow us the opportunity to do. Some of them are regional. They do require some regional partnerships. Some are entirely sort of local Maryland decisions. It just sort of depends on the project and where it's located. Obviously, something like the Long Bridge, which has an indirect benefit to Maryland, is really more of a Virginia, DC project. Other things are sort of more core to Maryland.
Thank you. All right, some more chats. Catherine Gorgorovich has made just a comment. Thank you, and we all need to weigh in on the environmental impact statement. Next, Tricia Trice has another statement. It is unconscionable for a legislator to commit future generations to contract with a 50-year span. Do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the legislature doing it, it's the governor. So as I said, it would be nice if the Senate sort of shared your view and affirmatively stepped in, but it's the governor that commits us to the contracts, not the legislature.
All right. Now one from Ursula Scott. What can I and other citizens do to effectively oppose the P3 270 Beltway project?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the comment that was made a few minutes ago about weighing in when the supplemental environmental impact statement comes out, obviously that's important, so sort of for the record, that there be a lot of citizens who have submitted their concerns in that process. But it's also advocating, frankly, to the, what I'll call the swing vote on this issue on the Board of Public Works for when the next contract comes back, which is Comptroller Francho. Comptroller Francho has used his role on the Board of Public Works to bring demonstrable improvements to this project, which I appreciate. He's done some things to make the project a little bit better, but he could also stop it in its tracks and really sort of reimagine what we're doing here. And so far, he's chosen not to do that, but he's the swing vote. The treasurer is firmly against it. The governor, not surprisingly, is firmly for it. So I would recommend continuing to advocate to the comptroller. Obviously, as I said, the state Senate needs to step up as well, but it's not your state senator. I mean, Susan Lee, again, is 100% with you, Ursula, on this issue. So, you know, it's great to reinforce, you know, your position with her, but you don't need to convince her. She's already there. It's some of her colleagues around the state that need the convincing, unfortunately.
The next question is from Tricia Trice. Can we force the Route 270, Route 495 project to expand the potential alternatives to include mass transit such as the monorail?
Yeah, I mean, we can't force it. I mean, obviously we could encourage it, or we could legislate it if the Senate was willing to play along. But that is really one of the shortcomings of the plan. I mean, if you're willing to accept, and I'm not necessarily willing to accept, but if you're willing to accept that it makes sense to expand the roadway, you know, I would think you would want to couple that with some pretty significant mass transit options. And that's not really happening. I mean, there's some ill-defined potential toll revenue that could go to transit someday. And there's been a little bit of planning, but not a lot of detail. So let me give you just a great recent example. We've been spending money as a state on this public-private partnership for about 4 years. Every year when the transportation budget comes out, I see the line item in there for the money that goes towards it. And what the transportation secretary says is the public-private partner will be repaying that money in the future. So at the end of the day, there's going to be no taxpayer dollars to go towards this project. That's what he says. We'll see if that adds up. But by that logic, we could also advance some of the money they claim they're going to be spending on transit. So the Montgomery County Council was promised, and it convinced 5 of them to flip their view on the project and say it was okay. Some transit investments would be made as a result of this project to something called the Corridor Cities Transit Way, which is sort of an up-county bus rapid transit line, or bus rapid transit on 355. But when the governor's draft transportation budget came out 2 weeks ago, there was no money for either of those projects in the budget. Well, if you believe that we can spend money right now on the P3 on the road side because the P3 partner will pay it back, that same logic should stand on the transit side if you're really serious that someday this is going to fund transit. I'm not sure they are. I think they're going to say the toll revenue hasn't materialized at a level sufficient to return the necessary funds to the P3 partner and then give the added money to transit. So it's definitely a big shortcoming in my mind of the project. I mean, I'll just give you one other example of what frustrates me. They talk a lot about using the toll lanes on the American Legion Bridge to run mass transit buses to and from Virginia, but it's not clear that Virginia can allow that. So Maryland may say they want to do it, but Virginia has a clause in its P3 contract that may basically prevent it from doing that. So that bus can travel across the bridge because Maryland, for weird historical reasons, actually owns the whole bridge and the whole river, unlike most rivers that are split states that are half and half, but that bus will not be able to stop anywhere. So it's nice to say you can run buses over the bridge, but they're not going to have a place to go. And there, again, no money has been committed to actually run those buses. They've just done sort of a study to say, yeah, this is something you could do. So it's definitely a big shortcoming with the project. Even if you accept the merits of the project, that's something that should be happening with it in my mind.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, Don Cherry, if you could unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Mark. A really good review of the issues. So you said you're going to talk about Purple Line, give us an update on that. And then also there's been talk of this high-speed line between the DC area and Baltimore. Is there anything progressing on that, or any further thoughts on that?
Sure. So on the Purple Line, yeah, I mean, I touched on this a little bit. So again, you know, when the governor came into office, he spent some time reviewing the Purple Line. He had been a skeptic of the project. He reduced the costs, probably in ways that will hurt us long-term with the project, and then entered the public-private, partnership contract. Time moves funny during COVID, so I can't quite remember if it was a year or a year and a half ago, but the public-private partnership began to fall apart. There were a few reasons for this. One reason was the delays because of litigation definitely had an impact on the project, but also some other things were going on. For example, the Maryland Department of the Environment, oddly, was very slow in issuing permits for the project, so it was delayed because of that. There were disagreements between the state and the public-private partner about what right-of-way needed to be acquired for the project, and there was a very large disagreement with the freight railroad over whether a crash wall needed to be put in place between the light rail line and the freight line. The railroad always said a crash wall needed to be there, but the bidder for the Purple Line said, we're going to convince them not to make us have that wall, so we're not going to include the costs of that wall in our bid. Well, fast forward 5 years, and the railroad is saying, no, you really need to have that crash wall there. And so the bid was not, the bidder, the contractor was not prepared to take that cost because it was going to mean the product was a money loser for them. So they walked away. The construction contractor left. The state had a few options at that time. One was to kill the project entirely. Another was to make it a sort of a traditional procurement and hire a construction company itself to continue the project as though it was a conventional product, the way most public works projects have been built in the United States for the past 250 years. And then the third option, the one it pursued, was to basically reinforce the public-private partnership, to find a new construction contractor to go into the public-private partnership consortium. And so that's the process they're in the middle of right now. They have a short list of new construction partners. They claim that by the end of this year, they will award that construction contract, and then that construction company will sort of take over construction. The project is obviously years behind schedule now. The state has been doing some direct work during this period of time. They've continued to do things like utility relocation, rail car manufacturing, a few other things, but a lot of the significant work, they're waiting for the construction company. So for example, there's one part of the Purple Line that still needs dynamite work, like blasting, which is to blast at Bethesda, to blast out the connection between the Purple Line station and the Bethesda Metro station, because there's going to be a new entrance. You can access the Bethesda Metro in the future from the same place you're going to be able to access the Purple Line. So there'll be an additional entrance to the Bethesda Metro. That requires very complex blasting work that the state's not doing. They're not working on it. They're not pursuing that. They're just waiting for the construction partner to come in to do that work. So there's work like that that's just sort of waiting to be done. On the line between Baltimore and DC, I think you're thinking of the maglev, the magnetic levitation proposal. This is a project that has been around since before I was born. I mean, it's a very long-standing idea that sort of comes back to life every 10 years or so. Right now, we're in a situation where a private entity says the private sector and the government of Japan will pay for the whole thing. You just have to let us do it between Baltimore and DC. It's extremely controversial, partly because it won't stop anywhere. So it's not going to provide any sort of local service or benefit to all the places it's running through. So normally, when you're running a rail line, obviously a lot of people who live right next to it don't like it, but you can sort of say there's going to be a benefit to you, right? You will be able to, I know the town of Chevy Chase does not like the Purple Line, but they're going to love being able to ride the metro, the light rail, excuse me, to Silver Spring or to New Carrollton or what have you. With the maglev, you don't have those local benefits, right? It's going to be just point to point. And that's great if you're commuting between Baltimore and DC. It's not as great if you're one of the neighborhoods along the way. So there's a lot of skepticism about the project. There's a housing development going up in one of the areas where they think the project needs to stop in Baltimore City. So that's causing some issues with it. I'll just say that in general, I'm a little skeptical of the shiny new object. And that goes to the monorail as well, which I know someone asked about a few minutes ago. We already have a train line that runs between Baltimore and DC. Actually, we have two of them, the Camden line and the Penn line. Amtrak runs on them, the MARC train runs on them. There's a lot we could do to enhance those lines and improve their capacity. And we don't necessarily need the shiny new object allegedly paid for by the government of Japan to get good rail service between Baltimore and DC. On the monorail, we already have a rail line that runs between Montgomery County and Frederick. It's the Brunswick line. Again, it's a MARC train line. There's a lot we could do to enhance the capacity on that line without resorting to the shiny new object that is the monorail or the maglev. Maybe I'm too, maybe I'm not ambitious enough thinking that way, but I'd like us to see us use the infrastructure we have better than just constantly looking over the horizon at the next shiny object.
Loretta, you have a chat question. Do you want to actually ask that in Mark and then conclude the meeting? Because we're just about at the 1 hour mark.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, for all of your insightful comments in your presentation. You serve on the Council of Governments. I just wondered if there's a role that the COG plays in transportation or climate change environment.
Right. So I actually don't serve on the Council of Governments. I serve on something under the Council of Governments called the Transportation Planning Board, which is a part of the Council of Governments. It's what's called a Metropolitan Planning Organization. A few years back, the federal government wanted to see sort of better transportation planning. So they required the creation of all these MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, to sort of organize the transportation planning for their regions to try to bring that more, Carl, to your point earlier, try to bring that more regional perspective. So that body has to, for example, put together a fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan. When I say fiscally constrained, I mean it can't be a magic plan that says we're going to build maglevs everywhere and monorails everywhere. It has to be something that's sort of within the realm of our budget to actually do. You have to be able to sort of show that within Maryland's budget, we'll be able to invest in this road or this rail line or that rail line, rebuild this bridge or that bridge. As part of that, there is a Clean Air Act analysis that has to be done. And in our MPO, we also have a climate goal as well. So when that plan is done, it is done taking in mind, Loretta, to your point, issues related to air pollution, both the sort of traditional types as well as greenhouse gas emissions to try to rein those things in. Frankly, in the last few years, there's been a pretty big change because Virginia is a part of the metropolitan region. And until very recently, they had a very different view on climate change. And I suspect many people on this call do, but they are now, much more active partners at the table in this discussion. And that's been really important. I think that was also important to seeing Metro get invested in as a region. The political changes in Virginia, they may not feel like they affect you directly, because thank you, you live in Maryland, please stay. But they actually do have an impact because we do share a region with them. I'll also add there's a separate clean air work group under the Metropolitan, the COG, the Council of Governments. And I just wanted to note that Delegate Sarah Love, one of your other delegates, actually serves on that body as well. So they do some work. They're not a regulatory body, right? So the COG can't regulate, but they do a lot of work around planning and modeling to try to help those who can regulate.
Thank you. Well, if that
I think
concludes,
that wraps it up. And I think we all want to gather and raise our palms together and thank Mark for a very enlightening. And again, you're taking your private time off on Sunday. I know that's your 24/7 job, but we personally do appreciate that so very much.
Well, thank you again for having me. My email address was in the chat, mark@markkorman.com. If there's anything we didn't cover today or you didn't want to ask. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank
Have
you.
a good
Bye-bye now.
afternoon. Okay, now I have to figure out how to stop recording and put it onto there.